As you guys know, Indiana was unstoppable in 2025. Indiana absolutely destroyed the competition in one of the most dominating college football seasons of all time. Including the playoffs, Indiana went 16-0, becoming only the second team in the history of college football to win 16 games in a season. The first team was this one, the 1894 Yale Bulldogs. Alright, I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that most of you probably don't know much about the 1894 Yale Bulldogs football team. In fact, most people don't. Actually, the state of research into the early history of college football is pretty deplorable, especially for anything before the mid-1920s. But that's what my channel's here to do, right? To turn a lot of this around. So stick around, and if you like it, consider supporting me. It's time that people got really interested in this old history and learned a thing or two. About 2 months ago, somebody on Reddit asked what would happen if the Yale team somehow came back to life and played in modern college football. Let's say that they learned how to play the modern game and they were able to lift weights the modern way, and then they were added to FBS as an independent. Would they survive or get creamed? Well, they would get creamed, of course, because they would still be undersized. In fact, I can actually show you this. So newspaper coverage of football in 1894 was actually better than it is these days, believe it or not. In particular, the articles before the Yale-Harvard game in 1894 contained a lot more information than you would have ever thought possible. Okay, first things first, this article on American Football Wiki is way off. It claims that only 15 games in 1894 can be accounted for since it skips the Harvard game, and Princeton is listed here as New Jersey. You need to go over to Wikipedia where you'll find something that was written by somebody who is not a grade A idiot, you know, like they made a table with actual sources. Yeah, imagine that, actually providing sources for your information. Anyway, the build-up to that Yale-Harvard game on Thanksgiving was absolutely huge. Yeah, Thanksgiving football was the thing back in 1894 and also like 1888 and like 1882 and so on and so forth. This is all before the forward pass was a thing, by the way. Harvard was a big rival of Yale, though Yale's biggest rival was actually Princeton. That was the biggest rivalry in college football at the time. Anyway, the articles as part of that build-up are the things that tell us all about that Yale football team. Since there was clearly no actual news in 1894, the Boston Daily Globe devoted just about the entire 12-page Saturday newspaper to previewing the Harvard-Yale game. Right here it tells us that the average weight of Harvard's starting 11 was a little over 173 pounds, while Yale weighed in at around 172 pounds. Yale's players averaged a little over 6 feet tall, while Harvard's players were 5'10" on average, and of course everybody was about 21 years old. I'm not going to reveal too much to you guys, but let me tell you that I'm guessing I probably would have fit in just fine on that Harvard team. Anyway, since we're focusing on the Yale team, we can see here that there were 17 players total, including all the substitutes. The heaviest was H.P. Cross at 203 pounds, 6'3", and the tender age of 21. The lightest was L. Hinkey, right end and brother of the captain. He was only 146 pounds and 5'11", so he must have looked like a string bean. Those were back in the days when it was pretty easy to figure out who every single player was, because there were only 17 of them. And I'll get back to the limited roster and the substitution rules in a minute. Meanwhile, Indiana's 2025 team featured so many players that I can't show you all of them. This is just a portion of the offense. Indiana's offensive line was filled with players taller and heavier than anyone on Yale's roster. I mean, even Fernando Mendoza was bigger than anybody on the Yale roster. And the defense is even crazier. Heck, even the kickers were bigger than just about anybody on that 1894 Yale team. I mean, the players could add muscle through training, right? But the problem is you can't add height, you know? So I'm a little bit shy of 5'9", and even if I spend hours working in the weight room, I'm not going to suddenly become like 6'4" or whatever. So based on size alone, you've got to conclude that Yale would probably not have a chance. But what would happen if you were going to take Indiana's 2025 team and stick it back in 1894? Well, I do think that things would be a lot different if that were the case. The first problem is that substitutes simply were not allowed in 1894 unless a player was either disqualified or seriously injured, and you couldn't stick those players back in the game. That was a problem, of course, since players did not wear helmets back then and the padding was pretty thin. Now, that extremely limited substitution rule alone would make it almost impossible for a modern team to compete, especially with so many players around 300 pounds or so. So what you have to realize here is that not allowing substitutions meant, of course, that players had to play both sides of the ball every single game. There was absolutely no offensive and defensive platooning. I mean, you didn't even have enough players to do it if you wanted to. Football had evolved from rugby, you see, and in rugby there were no substitutes at all unless somebody got hurt. It wasn't really until Teddy Roosevelt got involved in 1906 that substitutions really became a thing. Even then it was so severely limited, though, that most teams just didn't use them. So sometimes we don't really realize how good we have it. Now, the nice thing is that there were rules in those days prohibiting players from wearing, projecting nails and iron plates and other weapons on their shoes or parts of their body. You'd get kicked out of the game for fighting, and certain tackles and bad blocks would result in a 25-yard penalty or a free kick. This is back when rugby-style free kicks were still part of the game. Other penalties would result in a loss of down, and if the defense committed the penalty, the ball would be moved up 5 yards. Now, those are what the rules called for in theory. In practice, however, the sport was extremely violent. It was much more violent than you can imagine. We do not see this level of violence in modern football. In fact, we haven't seen anything quite like this for over a century. The nice thing is that some mass plays, like the famous flying wedge, were made illegal by 1894, but other mass plays continued. And with weak padding and no helmets, severe injury and even death on the playing field was something that was common. Back in those days, this nose guard was the closest thing you had to a face protector, and most players didn't wear it. Your uniform consisted basically of your extra heavy turtleneck sweater, though I assume players would wear extra layers underneath to provide at least some sort of padding. You could get football pants, of course. In fact, those haven't really changed much. Teams would wear a jacket over their sweater, and you could get your leather shin guard for $1.50, but that's all the protection that you had to choose from. Plays were chaotic and unorganized, and the lack of padding meant that injuries were extremely common. This was all exemplified in that Yale-Harvard game on Thanksgiving, which is what they called the Hampden Park Massacre. This was likely the most violent game in the history of college football, and of course it came in 1894. Honestly, I don't think that any modern team would survive in these conditions, especially without substitutions. In that famous Harvard-Yale game, 8 players out of the 22 starters wound up injured, some of which were severely hurt. Players were taken off the field on stretchers one after another, including numerous players within about a 5-minute interval. The most famous dirty play came when Hinkie, the captain of Yale, delivered a vicious blow to the Harvard left back, whose name was Wrightington, breaking his collarbone, and Hinkie received no penalty for his actions. Scenes like this one were pretty common, and you've also got to remember that they only had the medical facilities of the mid-1890s at their disposal. Now, the worst part of all is that there were no forward passes back in those days. The field was just as wide as it is now, and it was actually longer. It was 110 yards long. It's the same length as a Canadian football field. But you could only run the ball, which meant that teams would use those wedge-style offensive formations and just try to cram the ball down the throat of the defense over and over again. That's the reason why people kept dying. You can see this pretty easily through this diagram. The field itself is 330 feet long, or 110 yards. In fact, newspapers in the days before the forward pass would routinely diagram all plays in something like this, and if you look closely, you can see the references to the numerous player injuries. We just don't see anything like this today because of how much the forward pass has opened up the game. Every single play looks something like this, and you've got to remember that these guys had basically no pads on. So the biggest problem that Indiana would face if it went back to 1894 to take on Yale would be having to run the ball every single down, and almost all of these runs are just run straight up the gut because the defense knows that you're going to run, right? That would then be followed by the problem of having every player play both sides of the ball for the entire game. Now, they might also have a hard time figuring out how the scoring worked. By 1894, football scoring at least somewhat resembled the modern game, and it was a lot better than the early 1880s when only balls kicked through the uprights counted. A touchdown was worth 4 points, and the point after touchdown was actually 2 points, for a total of 6 possible points. Meanwhile, a field goal would get you 5 points, and a safety was worth 2 points for the defense. That part hasn't changed. And so when Yale beat Harvard 12-4, Harvard had 4 points because it scored a single touchdown but couldn't score the conversion afterwards. Now, there are a couple of other things that I probably should mention, mostly because they're either missing in the old rule book or they're so different that it's going to be shocking to you. Some of this is pretty surprising. For example, the offside rule was done rugby style. Basically, all players had to be behind the ball when their team had the ball. If you were on defense, you were pretty much automatically onside, and it had nothing to do with how you lined up before the snap. The player receiving the snap was prohibited from taking the ball forward. You had to hand it off or pitch it back every single down. it was only 5 yards for a first down, or you'd get another first down if you went backwards 20 yards, which is kind of an old rule, and you only had 3 downs instead of 4. And there was also a complex rule called a kick-out, which happened if there was a touchback, a safety, or a ball kicked out of bounds, and honestly, I'm not sure I understand how this worked. The other thing is that there was no false start rule back in those days. That doesn't come around until I think sometime around 1902, though it's not entirely clear. Anyway, all of this gives you at least sort of an idea of what a modern team would run into if it would play back in 1894. Now, the muscle you have today would help, sure, and so would the height. But the modern players would be very, very fatigued if they had to stay on the field for the full 60 minutes or 90 minutes, which is the length of the game back in 1894. Deaths in football were extremely common in those days, both because of the lack of helmets and because of the brutal ways that offenses would operate. Newspapers all over the United States called for the sport to be completely banned. Reports of old high school football games included descriptions of absolutely gruesome injuries. I'm talking about like kids breaking their necks while playing the game. And so even though the old sport was rougher, honestly, I've got to say that I prefer the modern sport to all of this injuries. So even something like unlimited substitution might make you think it's kind of weak at first until you look and realize what happens when you have players who are really fatigued and who've been, dealt hammering blows over and over and over again. Anyway, the truth is that 1894 Yale team, if they came into the modern game and had modern conditioning, would still get absolutely trounced. I mean, they only had 17 players. But if you were going to go back the other way with modern players, I'm pretty sure most of them would give up instead of risking possible death on the field. Anyway, let me know down in the comments what you think about all of this.